Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a centuries-old theological puzzle about who truly belongs in the church. Now, this debate over baptism can get incredibly complex. So, to make it fun and accessible, we're going to frame it around two imagined perspectives. In the blue corner, representing the Credo Baptist, or believer's baptism view, picture a brilliant Scottish woman. We'll call her Fiona. And in the red corner, representing the Paedo Baptist, or infant baptism view, imagine a sharp, thoughtful Irishman. Let's call him Sean. Using only the deep roots of Christian history and biblical texts, we're going to let their arguments clash. But remember, I'm just here to lay out the facts. It's entirely up to you to decide who wins.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with a deathbed mystery, then define the new covenant, look at the Hebrews warning, weigh the competing theological models, examine early church evidence, and finally, land on the ultimate deciding question.
All right, Section 1, the deathbed baptism mystery.
So, before Fiona and Sean go head-to-head on the theology, we really need to understand a strange historical phenomenon from the 3rd and 4th centuries. Why would someone as powerful as Emperor Constantine intentionally delay his baptism until he was literally on his deathbed? And he wasn't alone, by the way. This was a huge trend. You might be wondering, were they all just procrastinating? Well, actually, no. They were terrified.
The answer comes down to a really intense developing anxiety. See, back in the 1st century, early Christians firmly believed baptism cleansed you of your sins. But as we move into the 3rd and 4th centuries, this panicked logic kind of took hold. People started thinking, okay, if baptism washes away all my past sins, what on earth happens if I commit a terrible sin after I'm baptized? And the early church was incredibly strict about post-baptismal sin. So the reasoning became, the later you get baptized, the cleaner you die. Constantine literally waited until 337 AD, right before taking his last breath, just to make absolutely sure his slate was wiped clean for eternity.
Now, what's fascinating is that the church didn't actually invent or promote this delay. In fact, leaders pushed hard against it. Bishops like Basil and John Chrysostom were basically begging people not to wait. Augustine even supported infant baptism, at least in part, to avoid the massive terrifying risk of a child dying unbaptized. Eventually, the sacrament of penance developed, and that kind of cooled down this intense fear. But this deep historical anxiety perfectly sets the stage for the massive theological divide we're about to jump into.
Which brings us to Section 2, defining the new covenant.
So how do we strictly define the new covenant? To strip away all the heavy academic jargon, the new covenant is essentially the community of God's people. Simple enough, right? Well, the puzzle is over who exactly gets to be a member. Is it an exclusive club strictly for those who are inwardly genuinely saved? Or is it more of a mixed, visible community on earth containing both true believers and maybe some folks who are just along for the ride?
This is where we bring in Fiona, our Scottish Credo Baptist. She'd point straight to the text and say, listen, the prophet Jeremiah makes it clear as day. He prophesies that in the new covenant, they shall all know me, every single one of them. In her view, God's new community isn't some mixed bag of believers and non-believers. It's a pure community of the truly saved, right down to their very souls. This Credo Baptist model leans heavily, absolutely heavily, on this incredible promise from the book of Jeremiah. And honestly, Fiona's logic here is incredibly coherent. It goes like this. Step 1, the new covenant only contains people who truly know the Lord. Step 2, therefore there are absolutely no inwardly unsaved members hiding in the covenant. And step 3, if the covenant only contains true believers, then the sign of that covenant, which is baptism, must logically follow a credible personal profession of faith. You don't baptize infants because they obviously can't profess that saving knowledge yet. It's a really tight, brilliant argument.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, the Hebrews warning passage.
But here is where the plot totally thickens. Enter Sean, our Irish Paedo Baptist, who brings a massive, text-based challenge right back at her. He respects Fiona's view, sure, but he points us to this rather terrifying warning in the epistle to the Hebrews. You can imagine him saying, now hold on a minute, Fiona. Look at Hebrews 10. This passage intensely describes someone who falls under severe judgment, someone who turns their back on God. But look at what the text calls him. It says he was sanctified by the blood of the covenant. That is explicit new covenant language being applied to someone who is ultimately lost.
This brutally forces us to ask a tough question. Can a person be meaningfully attached to the covenant without actually having an inward, saving knowledge of God? Sean argues, absolutely, yes they can. For him, Hebrews proves that you can be outwardly, visibly attached to the church, set apart by baptism, and still not have true saving faith on the inside. And if that covenant community on earth is mixed, well then bringing infants into that visible community through baptism makes perfect sense.
Let's look at how these compare in Section 4, competing theological models.
to handle this immense biblical tension between Fiona's pure community and Sean's mixed community. Both sides have built really robust frameworks. Fiona, our Credo Baptist, argues the covenant is exclusively the inwardly saved. So when Hebrews mentions someone being sanctified, she argues that just means they had external exposure to the church. They were around it, but never truly in the new covenant. On the other hand, Sean, our Pedo Baptist, argues the covenant operates on two different layers. There's a visible historical community on earth that includes infants and even some false believers, alongside the inward spiritual reality of the truly saved.
Putting these side by side brilliantly illustrates the cost of each view, because they both have one. Fiona's model beautifully preserves Jeremiah 31, everyone in the covenant knows God, case closed. But her pressure point? She has to redefine the word sanctified in Hebrews as mere external exposure, which Sean argues really weakens the text. On the flip side, Sean's model takes that Hebrews warning at full terrifying strength. People really can be in the visible covenant and fall away. But his pressure point is having to explain how Jeremiah's promise that all will know the Lord applies to a mixed church that clearly includes people who don't. So you see, both sides have to wrestle with something uncomfortable.
All right, moving into history. Section 5, Early Church Evidence.
So if the Bible is a bit of a tug-of-war here, what did the earliest believers actually do? Well, history shows a developing practice without a really explicit early command. Fiona rightly points out there's literally no verse in the New Testament that explicitly says baptize your babies. True enough, but Sean is quick to counter that infant baptism appears very early in church history, long before Augustine, and it spreads everywhere. And remember that early writer Tertullian who told people to delay baptism? He did that out of that exact pastoral fear of post-baptismal sin we talked about earlier. He didn't say stop baptizing babies because the new covenant is for believers only. He just said, wait so they don't sin and ruin it.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating about this early era is the silence. Think about it. If Fiona's view was the strict, universally understood rule of the apostles, Sean argues we should see early church writers aggressively condemning infant baptism as a clear violation of a believers-only new covenant. But we don't. No early writer explicitly claims infant baptism contradicts a known apostolic rule. That silence is weighty. But of course, Fiona fires back that silence isn't a command, and the biblical text itself has to be our ultimate guide.
Which finally brings us to Section 6, the ultimate deciding question.
We've completely bypassed all the peripheral arguments today and landed exactly on the core fault line you really have to wrestle with. Because ultimately, this debate isn't merely about the physical act of getting baptized. No, it's a profound puzzle about the very nature of God's people. Are God's people on earth a perfectly pure, strictly spiritual reality, or are they a messy, multi-generational, visible administration? Fiona says pure, Sean says visibly mixed.
So, the crucial point, and the exact question I'm leaving you to ponder today, is this. Is the new covenant primarily defined by its internal saving reality or by its historical, visible administration? Because if you believe, like our Scottish friend Fiona, that it's strictly an internal reality where every single member inherently knows the Lord, well, you must adopt believer's baptism. But if you believe, like our Irish friend Sean, that the covenant is a visible administration in history that includes true believers alongside their children and even some who might eventually fall away, you'll find infant baptism deeply coherent. You have the facts. You see the core tensions. Which model do you think best accounts for the mystery of the text? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.